Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera and a very good morning to everyone. Welcome to this keynote session, the second keynote in this seminar. Thank you, Puan Hikmah. I think it's a wonderful name for a seminar on philosophy. We have with us this morning Prof. Osman Bakar, Prof. Emeritus Prof. Osman Bakar. I'm very sure everybody in this group knows him. But as a moderator for the session, I need to do my duty, and that is to give a short introduction. If I can present Prof. Osman as somebody in the context of IIIT vision and mission, Prof. Osman has been one of the leading contributors in the discourse between tradition on the one hand and modern science or modern knowledge on the other. The discourses between religion and science, between religion and philosophy, which he will be discussing today, areas that on the surface may seem to be contradictory and even separate discourses. I think Prof. Osman has been one of the few who have tried to see this discourse in an integrated way and has tried to bridge these two seemingly contradictory areas. If you look at his very illustrious career, he started off as a mathematician, both in his undergraduate as well as in his master's, but then later on moved to Islamic philosophy of science, where he did his PhD under Prof. Syed Hussein Nasr. He's written immensely, more than 20 books. The latest, one of his latest books on the classification of knowledge has recently been cited as being one of the top 10 most popular books. He's written more than 300 articles, and I shed to think how many conferences and presentations he has made in his career. So he's really a very well qualified person to talk about this. And today he will be presenting his keynote address on the complementary roles of philosophy and religion in civilization building. Yeah, a very important point, I think, in the case of Malaysia, in the case of the region, this idea of civilizational building is very, very crucial today, especially with all these challenges that we are facing, which seems to be actually taking us apart rather than bringing us together. So Prof. Osman, who has a very long background from his days in University Malaya, from his time in George Washington University, his time in Brunei Darussalam, and now back in IIUM with ISTAC. He is really the right person maybe to present his views. Keynote addresses usually don't have Q&A sessions, but I think organizers have said that we do want to allow sufficient time for question and answers. And therefore, Prof. Osman, really the floor is yours to speak as long as you want, maybe 50 minutes, 1 hour, and then we will try to open the session for questions after that. And we hope to end the session latest by 12:15 because we have other sessions after this. So with that very brief introduction, I now have the pleasure to invite Professor Emeritus Osman Bakar to make his presentation on the topic, the complementary roles of philosophy and religion in civilization building. Prof, the floor is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good morning, salam sejahtera. Thank you, Professor Aslam, for the kind words. Thank you to all the previous speakers, particularly Datuk Sri Anwar just now. I missed the earlier one, but I managed to get to listen to Datuk Anwar. And thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak on this topic the complementary roles of philosophy and religion in civilization building. Well, these two words, religion and philosophy, kind of two magical words that easily provoke people into discussion. Sometimes can be quite intense discussion, because it is a pleasant topic to talk about, but it can also be controversial. But my job today, this morning, is to talk about the complementary roles of the two. And when I say complementary roles, that does not exclude overlapping and common roles. In a sense, then when I talk about complementary roles, also talk about some of the overlapping and common roles. That is to be expected, because there's no strict division. You cannot really separate philosophy and religion and say, well, philosophy constitutes one distinct domain, and religion constitutes another domain, and the two simply divided by one clear line. That's not the case. As you shall hear me speaking later, in referring to a number of thinkers, scholars, they would be saying that in philosophy, there is religion. In religion, there is philosophy. So the two interacted. They interact. So it's very, very difficult to separate between the two. All right, let me illustrate this idea of complementary role by referring to a number of thinkers and scholars, as I said. I want to start with Albert Einstein. I'd like to start with Albert Einstein, the person out of the figures that I'm talking about is the nearest to us in time. Albert Einstein died in 1955. That was 65 years ago. But some of the words of wisdom from him still, lingering in our mind. So I would like to quote these familiar words of wisdom from him. He said, "Science without religion is blind. Religion without science is lame." Famous words from Einstein. Yes, for many of us, I find that in my years of being students of philosophy and science, many people love to quote that, but fewer people would like care to explain what is meant by that quotation. So, first of all, what is the message? What is the core message of these words of wisdom from Einstein? Well, the simple message it conveys is that civilization needs both science and religion. That is a simple message. But I'll go further now to explain in what sense do we mean, or in a sense he would mean, that science would become blind without religion. I just to give a short explanation to this. All right. Someone may object. How can you say that without religion, science would be blind? When science, modern science, has managed, to create all the scientific, the technical gadgets, the telescope, the mighty telescopes, and so on, to pierce into the heavens. They have the modern science, modern cosmology has managed to visit, to penetrate the different corners of the universe. So how can you say that it is blind? It's not using religion, but it's able to do that. On the other hand, science, modern physics, has been able to penetrate matter to the smallest particles. We're able to see, yes, through powerful instruments, but with those instruments, science is able to see the underlying reality of the material world. So it's not blind. And then within us, even within our own within us as human being, right? Science has penetrated the depth of our existence to the smallest virus and cellular elements as found in microbiology, for example. So all that without the help of religion. So science, not blind. So obviously then, when Einstein said that without religion, science would be blind, he means something else. He means something else. Yes, all those examples that I gave, science could see that, but where science is blind is that, number one, it is blind as to what is true nature is, what is true purposes is. So science is ignorant of its own nature, of its own purposes, of its own limitations. It knows of them. To be sure, science knows some aspects of it, but it doesn't know the whole truth about its nature, its limitations, its purposes. It needs something else. And this is where I think in a strict sense, the correct word would be science will be half blind, not blind. It is able to see half of reality, but it is not able to see another half of reality. It reminds us of the one-eyed Dajjal, the symbolism of the one-eyed. Sees only one reality, but does not see the other reality. So I think that's what I understand, having studied Einstein, and furthermore, see Einstein, we have to understand the context in which he was making that statement. Einstein was different from many other scientists of our time, the so-called empirical scientists, whose experience is only what is the empirical experience. What cannot be empirically experienced does not exist, does not mean anything, right? And you have the philosophers like Bertrand Russell, whose reality is determined by logic. But Einstein is not that. And Einstein, the philosopher, not the same as Bertrand Russell, and not the same as many scientists whose reality means only what can be empirically proved and verified. Otherwise, it's not reality. But Einstein shares many common traits with classical Muslim philosophers, like the school or the philosopher scientists, the Peripatetic school, Farabi, Ibn Sina, and so on. All right. So Einstein is closer to that school. So that's why in some of my writings I refer Albert Einstein as a philosopher scientist. He was both a philosopher and a scientist. And the science, after all, look at his theory of relativity. Today, some people say, how can we prove? Yeah, for Einstein, truth about reality can be proved other than empirical method. And one of the things that Einstein is famous for is the use of mathematical method. Mathematical method is not the same as empirical method, but he predicted many things which were only later to be empirically improved. But he didn't say that, okay, you don't believe because it is, I didn't prove it empirically. It doesn't mean that's not true. So later on, the empirical proofs came in. But for him, not only that, Einstein also believes in aesthetics of science. Very few people now, very few scientists now, would they say aesthetics proofs cannot be taken as scientific proof. But for Einstein, he said, what is beautiful must be true. It's aesthetic thing. In other words, aesthetics does come into the picture in the design, in the construction of the universe by God. So simplicity is also is a proof of truth. Say, E equal to mc squared. It's very simple, but it's very, very powerful. It proves many truths through that formula. So that is that have to understand what he means that science would be blind without religion, because religion provides the other dimension that which science is blind. Now, how can we explain? In what sense? In what sense would religion be lame without science? Lame. Well, religion, precisely because religion needs proofs, needs rational proof, needs rational support, needs intellectual support. So just look, for example, at the 6 articles of the Islamic faith. Believe in God, believe in the angels, believe in the messengers and prophets, believe in the books, scriptures, revelation, believe in the last day, believe in divine determination and measure, qadar and qadar. One, of course, you just accept. You just accept that's on the matter of faith, based on faith. But there are many other people, many other Muslims, especially the philosophers, who want to understand those articles of faith in a rational manner. So if believers of a particular religion accept their religion purely on the basis of faith, they're going to be based on very, very shaky ground. Because the real faith is based upon knowledge. True faith is based upon knowledge. Faith that's not based upon knowledge, there is weak faith. So I think the religion needs science in order to be its true self, in order to be whole. Otherwise, religion will be on shaky ground. And religion does provide that space for science to play its role. So that's it. Without science, religion cannot stand by itself. Religion cannot walk, let alone run. Religion will be static, not dynamic. So that's what it means by religion will be lame without science. So in the sense that religion and science are not opposed to each other. All right, some people may object or say, Professor Osman, I'm now talking about quoting Einstein, I'm talking about religion and science, but the topic of our session is religion and philosophy. Isn't it different? Am I off the track? No, because for Einstein, when he understands science, includes also philosophy. Just look at his theory of relativity. Is theory of relativity pure science, as we some of us insist in? No, there's philosophy there. All right. So, of course, I'll come to the Muslim philosophers later, but that's it. All right. So, what is the complementary role here that we see? Taking an example of science and religion in the words of wisdom of Einstein. Well, I noted here, science will make religion enlightened. Science will make religion enlightened. And religion will make science to be true, to be its true self, to be true to itself. Together, religion and science should be able, or will be able, to meet the spiritual, rational, intellectual, ethical, and material needs of human beings, both individual and collective. That is together. Together, that's what religion and science can do, can contribute. In other words, going back to the question, what are the fundamental needs of human beings? We must address this question. Religion is interested in addressing the needs of human beings in their totality. Philosophy is interested in answering the question, what are the needs of human being? In a civilization that is complete, in a civilization as balanced, holistic, these needs will be met. So the purpose of science is not purely to meet the material needs of human beings, no matter how advanced those material goods delivered by science. Take, for example, the question of rational intellectual needs. Now, in trying to understand this, we cannot reduce people's needs to one common denominator. Different individuals have different needs. Yes. What is different? In what sense the needs are different from each other? Not in kind, but in terms of the extent, the scope. Right? Everybody needs spiritual needs. Anybody has to have spiritual needs to fulfill spiritual needs. But the spiritual needs are not the same. It will be wrong for a particular individual, a particular person, trying to judge the needs of other people based on their own needs. All right, Al-Ghazali said to his fellow dialectical theologian, you are happy with Kalam, you feel satisfied, contented, by all means. But I'm not. So since I'm not contented with what your theology offered to me, don't stop me from fulfilling my needs in other areas. But now we have this idea of people want control everybody, even it comes to needs. So what they need is the same for everybody. But it's not true. Even in our physical needs, even our makan, our eating, yeah, we are interested in having different food, even the same food. Some people eat more, some eat less. I mean, that is the nature of things. So the same thing should be applied to ideas. Same thing, rational needs. Everybody asks the question, why? Why this happened? Why that happened? But this rational need is not the same. In other words, some people, you answer the question why, one statement is where they feel happy, contented. But some people, no. They keep on asking, why this, why this? And then you make a judgment on that person. This person is causing trouble. I lost the... Hello?
Yes, Prof, you are okay.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, okay.
You hear me? Okay. I lost that. Yes. The question of rational intellectual needs of human beings are not the same. The same thing, even the material needs. So, but anyway, religion and science together fulfill that. Are able to fulfill those needs according to the different individuals. All right, next I would like to go to Al-Farabi, 1,000 earlier than Einstein. Al-Farabi died in 950. Now, I quote here because I want to make quotations that have relevance to the topic of my presentation this morning. This I paraphrased Al-Farabi. He talks about the ideal relationship between religion and technology. Religion and technology. Of course, the word here, because here we use the word religion, is an English word, but what was the term used by Al-Farabi? He used the term Sharia. Sharia, the divine law of Islam. And the other one is technology, Sana'ah, technology, which can also be translated as the art. It's precisely because traditional art is what technology is all about. And Al-Farabi was talking about the relationship between religion and technology, or Sharia and Sana'ah, in the context of his theory of happiness. You have to understand that, the context of talking about his theory of happiness. So basically, I did produce this statement in one of my long essays on the science and technology. Sharia without technology is impotent. I repeat, Sharia without technology is impotent. Technology without Sharia is arrogant. Technology without Sharia is arrogant. So this can be said in the equivalent way. Sharia with technology is lame, and technology without Sharia is blind. Because guess in a sense, equivalent that. So what is the main message of those words from Al-Farabi? Basically, in which book, those who are interested to follow this up, Al-Farabi wrote a book, The Attainment of Happiness. It contains his comprehensive theory of happiness. It has been translated into English, that book, and I would advise you to read that. It's interesting book. So what's the main message? The main message from Al-Farabi is that civilization needs both technology and Sharia for its health. In other words, for a healthy civilization, technology and the Sharia is needed. Of course, the problem is when the word Sharia mentioned, all the kinds of prejudices and misconceptions go into that. But what I mean by Sharia, I'm referring to that entire body of principles, the revealed principles in the Quran regarding that guide human life in all spheres of life, in all aspects. So I'm not going into the nitty-gritty of the details of the Sharia, but Sharia as a divine law that has the purpose of guiding individuals and society to live the good life. I think that's the whole meaning of that. So it was in that sense that Al-Farabi talked about technology and Sharia. So the same thing as I did in the case of Einstein, I would like to explain in what sense technology would be arrogant. In what sense technology would be arrogant without Sharia? Well, we also are aware that without the Sharia, as we normally understand it, in reference to Islam, for example, or to those religions that have Sharia, so it might be a little different in the case of Christianity, for example. Christianity and Buddhism do not have the Sharia in the sense that Judaism and Islam have, for example. So therefore, the question of law, the question of ethics would have a different, based on a different context. But here, it's basically referring to the Islamic civilization. Al-Farabi was addressing Islamic civilization when he said that Islamic civilization needs both technology and the Sharia. Two forms of, or two shapers of human conduct, human behavior. In a sense, technology is also a shaper of human conduct, of human life. So it's Sharia. Just as there was that interaction between religion and philosophy, now we have interaction between technology and Sharia. I would like to take the example of America in talking about this relationship between technology and the Sharia. Because for America, of course, it's empty. Sharia in the sense of the revealed law. But the belief in technology in America, more than even in other parts of Europe, in Europe, is the belief, the strong belief that technology is the solution to all human problems. Technology is the solution to all human problems. That is the Sharia of America. So the Sharia of America means that you don't need Sharia that is revealed by God, because technology is the kind of the efficacious, is the in all technology and the way of life. Every problem can be solved by technology. If it's not yet solved, just wait a little more time. Give a little more time, you will find the answer. But going back to divinely revealed law, to in a sense to regulate, to guide your human behavior, sorry, no way. That's why the opposition to Sharia in United States is very strong. But that's what I mean by the arrogant, because to be arrogant is to overestimate yourself. To overestimate. In other words, you have a certain capability, capacity, power, but you always go beyond that and say that you are more than that. Just that statement, when you say that technology is the solution to all problems, isn't that arrogant? It is. It sounds arrogant, right? Whereas the reality is technology is a powerful tool to change society, but it does not have the efficacy to solve all problems. And therefore, in that sense, it is weak. Now, the other one, the other part is that in what sense Sharia will be impotent? This will be contrary to what some Muslims believe, especially those, who the moment they have political power, they will shout in the street, then today we implement all the Sharia and all problems will be gone. You have that kind among the Muslims. So what's the difference between the counterpart and the secular counterpart saying that you have, with technology, will solve a problem. Now you had the religious, the religious. Hello, can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, Prof. We hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Now it's clear.
Yeah. Technology. Yes. I said just now, according to Al-Farabi, that the Sharia will be impotent without technology. Well, what do you mean by that? By being impotent? Among others, this idea of impotence on part of the Sharia without technology is that the Sharia will be static, not dynamic. You are happy, the laws are there, say that, whatever the laws have been formulated, they are there, but it's not moving, does not have the gear, the right gear to move, just depending on simple faith, the blind faith, blind obedience. This is the law of God, and therefore it will solve our problem. But that is not the message of the whole Sharia. The Sharia is much more than that. Now, it is also important in the sense that it is not efficacious. It's not able to solve certain problems, maybe not always, it's not able to solve problems of society. For example, let's say, epidemics. Epidemics or pandemics, different kinds of diseases. How can we solve that without science and of course, and also the medical technology and so on? It's not effective, especially in our modern times when our world is interdependent. So the challenge in terms of finding solutions to problems, these pandemics, certainly the need for the right form of technology. So I'm saying that Sharia without technology would be ineffective, not efficacious. Another thing about this importance of the Sharia in the absence of technology is that it becomes prescriptive, formalistic. The Sharia will become formalistic and not creative. How many of us Muslims talk about the creative aspects of the Sharia? Sharia as a creative force, rather than merely as a prescriptive force, creative. But the history of Islamic science, the history of Islamic astronomy, the history of geography, if you go through that history carefully, the role of technology in advancing knowledge in these different fields. In terms of, let's say, for example, just to locate carefully where Mecca is for those Muslims who live in Spain, those who live in China, in the fringes of the globe. How to calculate, how to determine as correct as possible is the role of science and technology. That is reference to prayer, right? So, and of course, the question of advancement in Islamic astronomy, thanks to technology. In the 13th century, the observatory in what is today Azerbaijan was the best in the world. The best research center in the world. That was the observatory. They appears also into the heavens, headed by Nasiruddin Tusi. His fellow scientist, assistant was Kutubuddin Shirazi, one of the persons I dealt in my book, Classification of Knowledge. I used to say that the observatory in Maragha, Azerbaijan, was the Cape Kennedy of the day. The Cape Kennedy of the day. They do research on orbital motions of the planets and so on, apart from looking at the new moon and so on, the motion of the planets. That is in the name of the Sharia. Science, as David King used to say, a historian of Islamic science, the science that serves the Sharia. Science that serves the Sharia. So that's what I meant. Yeah. So basically, Sharia without technology means also that society will be poorer in wealth, because technology is a creator of wealth. It's a tool to create wealth. Well, if you don't have wealth, how can you distribute? How can you do the ethics of distribution as required in Islam? Yeah, you do zakat, you do other things, donations, and so on. It all depends based on the assumption that there is wealth to distribute. So in Islamic civilization, for example, it goes to do that. That in the sense that the creative and distributive aspects must go together. And also, without technology, the more general questions, earlier during the question time with Datuk Sri Anwar, somebody asked about the maqasid. Yes, without technology, how can the maqasid be realized in society? Go through all the purpose of the Sharia. In other words, what it means is that the Sharia is not able to realize its own purposes and objectives without the good help from technology. So, and for Farabi, he came to this. For him, for Al-Farabi, the complementary role of Sharia and technology is that technology would serve Sharia and its maqasid. Technology provides material tools and occasions for the flourishing of moral goods. That's one message that he gave. And as far as Sharia is concerned, Sharia would guide technology on its right, legitimate track to its real objectives. In other words, it's ethical. The pursuit of technology will be based on ethical ground. It is technology for the common good, not an empowerment of the rich, not an empowerment of the powerful, but Sharia is very, very concerned about technology that serves the common good. And together, Sharia and technology will help guarantee the attainment of happiness, because he talked all about that in the context of his theory of happiness. And of course, here happiness is both individual and societal. Where he talks more about societal. How can a society attain happiness? Of course, except for a few people nowadays, happiness is still not a category. It's not a kind of good that should be pursued. It should be, because very difficult. How difficult? Because people don't know what is happiness. Yes, it's true. Nowadays, people don't know the meaning of happiness. So if you don't know the meaning of happiness, how can you pursue happiness? Yeah? So such is the situation today. So please read Al-Farabi to find out what this happiness is all about. And what Sharia and technology can do together. It is balanced prosperity. Balanced prosperity in spiritual and moral goods, in artistic goods. I repeat, artistic goods, intellectual goods, and material goods. Again, like in the case of religion and science with Albert Einstein, now we see that we converge this question of what are the needs of human beings. We need spiritual and moral goods. We need artistic goods. We need intellectual goods. We need material goods. Now I go to the third person, Al-Ghazali, who died in 1111. In the case of Al-Ghazali, it's saying almost, it's about the same, but it's put it in a different way. You know? As you can see, maybe before, still with regard to Al-Farabi, in the case of Farabi, we say religion and technology, but the word for religion is Sharia. Now, in the case of Albert Einstein, of course, the English word religion, but what he has in mind more is theology, more in the sense of theology rather than ethics. But in the case of Farabi, Sharia. Later, I will tell you what is the significance after talking about Al-Ghazali. So Al-Ghazali, a very, very profound statement that I really like. I mean, again, Al-Ghazali was one of the thinkers I did my PhD thesis. In his book, the Risalah al-Laduni, he said that what is religious is rational intellectual, and why is rational intellectual is religious. Now, the words, the Arabic words he used, of course, what is Shar'i is aqli. What is aqli is Shar'i. No, this comes from, these are the words from the man who has been accused of, of destroying reason, killing reason and anti-reason or something. No, yeah. I repeat, for those who know what is religious is rational intellectual. What is rational intellectual is religious. In other words, it conforms to the truth of revelation. Now, what is the message of Al-Ghazali? Sharia is not hostile to reason. So there are Muslims who are afraid of using reason, or is afraid of using a lot of reason. Say, oh, we do not want to use to reason, but want to expect others also to behave the same. But the message from Al-Ghazali is that the Sharia is not hostile to reason, nor is reason undermining the Sharia. On the contrary, rationality is the essence of the Sharia. This comes from the word, of course, who in his young days, or when he was a child, only had one ambition, to be a lawyer. He wanted to be a lawyer. because lawyers were very well paid also at that time. So his mind was very rational. What do you expect? All lawyers are rational, except that sometimes too rational or rationalistic. Yeah. But he said rationality is the essence of the Sharia. Now, if you think carefully of this statement from Al-Ghazali, it's almost stating what Einstein said, what Al-Farabi said, but the emphasis is more on here. The emphasis is different here, or the context is different, right? The context here is in the time of Al-Ghazali, many people who abandoned religion in the name of rational thought, or harder, if not religion altogether, who abandoned the Sharia. They feel they are intellectuals, they were thinkers, they don't need to pray and do the other intentions of the Sharia. That was the context. That was the society he was facing at the time. This was this is not 20th century. That was, you know, what we are talking about 11th century and 12th century, because they lived during those two centuries. But he emphasized that the unity between the Sharia and the Aqli, between religion and again here the word is Sharia. Now, since there are two times already, in the case of Farabi, for religion there is a Sharia. In the case of Ghazali also, and except for the first, in the case of Einstein, it is about religion, which is a theology. I would like to emphasize here that when we use English words, as Einstein did, the context was Western, Christian, Judeo-Christian, Western, in which religion possesses a certain connotations, the meaning. In the case of the West, as I will be saying something a little bit about Thomas Aquinas afterward, the core of religion in the West was theology. The core of religion in the Islamic civilization was not theology, but Sharia. You see, what is central in one religion may not be central in another religion. That is important to realize, especially for students of comparative religion, because it's different. So in the case of the Christian world, theology is central because of the nature of the message. The message centers on Christ. God sends his only son in order to provide salvation to human beings. Yeah? So therefore, that was the fundamental issue faced by Christian theology. But in the case of Islam, the centrality of the Sharia, because theology did not have, in the sense that theology in the sense of knowledge of God, the knowledge of God in Islam does not have, in a sense, special groups are considered as experts. We don't have that in Islam. Of course, the word kalam has been translated as theology and mutakallim as theologian by Western scholars, but that is not correct. That is not really correct. That's why I personally, in my own case, I use the word dialectical theology. So the reason is that in Islam, the experts on God do not just come from one school. In other words, everybody talk about God. Yes, it's from different perspectives. For example, the jurists, the fuqaha, will talk about God as the lawgiver. So they don't talk about the entire attributes of God, but they just select one that is the most relevant to their field, which is about law, that God gives the law. So God as the lawgiver. In the case of the mutakallimun, they talk about theology, yeah, they talk about God, but they selected out of so many divine qualities and attributes, they selected a few, basically emphasize more that God is the most powerful. God is God wills everything. Everything depends on God's will. So the attribute of this divine will and divine power override all other attributes. But then the philosophers also talk about God. Maybe the philosopher, the attributes of God that the philosophers talk a lot more about, like what Aristotle did about the first and the beginning and the beginning and the last, al-awwal al-akhir. For example, the God as the what they call the cause of everything. So those attributes of God that have close connection with the kind of science they were doing. That's why some people, the other schools, for example, especially the Sufis, would say that the God of the philosophers, is not, in other words, it's not, it does not really touch the heart. It only touches the mind, but not the heart. There is a complaint, because precisely the philosophers talk about a particular set of divine qualities. But what about the other qualities? That God is the loving, the merciful, the compassionate, and so on. The philosophers talk less about that, but the Sufis talk a lot more about that because it concerns the heart. So this is important. But I'm telling you this, I'm emphasizing this because we are now using in English. We are using English words, religion, right? And therefore, we have to understand the context in which the term has been used. Because in Arabic, maybe different words have been used for religion. And when they are translated into English, religion. And this is what happened to Ibn Rushd. Recently, I gave a talk about this differences between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. Now, Ibn Rushd, he died 1198. Later, he came later. Ibn Rushd was born after Al-Ghazali already died. Al-Ghazali already passed away. So the question of a showdown between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd did not exist. You cannot talk of a showdown between two figures, one already in the grave and the other still alive. So Ibn Rushd criticized the tahafut al-falasifa, the destruction of the philosophers or the incoherence of the philosophers. But Al-Ghazali, of course, will not be able to reply. But my point here, in our context, I would like to refer to the work of Ibn Rushd, the harmony between religion and philosophy. But in that title, Ibn Rushd used the word for religion that has been in the translation is hikmah, not Sharia, but hikmah. He used the word hikmah. Hikmah, what is hikmah? What is the relationship between hikmah and philosophy and falsafa? Well, to me, in general, I mean, the two terms overlap, but there are certain differences in which they differ. But what is important to bear in mind is that, no doubt, due to Al-Ghazali's attack on the falasifa, on the philosophers, the practices of philosophers, even at the level of terminology, you could detect certain changes. In other words, instead of falsafa, instead of the word falsafa, the word hikmah was more frequently used. It's an indication in the sense that Islamic philosophy was turning away from the Greek tradition more and more into its own inner tradition, because the word hikmah is contained in the Quran, in the Hadith. What it means is Sophia. What is understood as hikmah in Arabic, that will be Sophia as understood by Plato and Aristotle. Falsafa is the love. Philosophia, that is the love. There's a difference. a subtle difference between to say wisdom and the love of wisdom, or the Sophia and love of Sophia. So in the case of Ibn Rushd, in this particular book, he used the word hikmah. And he said, as for religion, the word Sharia. So again, in the case of, as in the case of Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, it's not deen, it's not a deen. Because when say, I suppose when you say you want to translate from English into Arabic, when you use the word religion, I'm sure some of you will translate as a deen. But it's no, yes, it's Sharia. And the Sharia is not equal to the deen. The Quran is the proof. All right? So in other, of course, Sharia is the core of religion. So what is the message of Ibn Rushd was that philosophy and religion are in harmony. Hikmah and Sharia in harmony. Now, of course, the question of Ibn Rushd has, I mentioned in my presentation last time. Somehow, Ibn Rushd has been misunderstood in the West. Ibn Rushd has a large influence in the West, being a Spanish Muslim, in Cordoba. His works translated into Latin. So he even had a fan club among the Latin scholars who liked him very much, but somehow Ibn Rushd has been misunderstood. What was the misunderstanding, Bob? They claim that Ibn Rushd believed in the double truth theory, the two different truths, the truth of reason and the truth of revelation, or the truth of philosophy and the truth of religion. But those who study Ibn Rushd know very well that it's not true. But the wrong misunderstanding about Ibn Rushd was disseminated in the West. The people, his followers who believe him, who really believe that he was like that, and that was later to contribute to the tension and conflict between revelation and reason in the West. Ibn Rushd was not to be blamed, but those who understood him wrongly were to be blamed for that. Because Ibn Rushd believed that in one body of truth, revelation and reason are two paths to the same truth. Of course, some Muslims do not accept it. How can philosophy can lead to the truth of revelation? Kutubuddin Shirazi, by the way, said yes, more or less, but there are a few exceptions. In other words, there are certain aspects with regard to the Sharia that philosophy cannot arrive at the truth of revelation, but have to accept it. Accept it, but it is intelligible. But philosophy cannot arrive at some of the doctrines, some of the maxims in the Quran with regard to, for example, the question of fasting and other things, or prayer. Reason cannot establish that. We have to depend on revelation. But for most of the truths of religion, basically the fundamental truths of revelation, like the existence of God, the unity of God, the existence of the angels, and so on, the unity of the universe, all these doctrines, all these principles were established by the Muslim philosophers by means of reason. But I would like to tell you later this very interesting connection. What Ibn Rushd also accepted is this. Number one, if our reason, our intellect, our uncle is healthy, really healthy, wholesome, then that reason, the uncorrupted reason will be able to reach at the fundamental truth of revelation. It's a very, very important claim. Well, in principle, some people may not be able to see that, to arrive at that, but in principle, but in fact, in the case of some Muslim intellectual scholars, they do accept that, and they do experience that in their intellectual life. They did demonstrate at this fundamental truth. If you go through the works of the Muslim philosophers, they will go on proving independently of revelation. And that's one thing that Ibn Rus believed. But this is not contrary to what Al-Ghazali also believed. The thing with Al-Ghazali is that the starting point is different. Ibn Rus has a different starting point. Ibn Rus' starting point is, if our reason, akal, is healthy and wholesome, we will arrive at the fundamental truth of revelation. The premise is our akal is healthy and wholesome. But Al-Ghazali, being a Sufi, who also wants to start from the empirical facts. What is the empirical fact? What is the actual thing that is that exists in our being, in our society? Well, due to another part of our individuality, namely our shahwat, our hawa, our reason can be corrupted. So Al-Ghazali starts from the premise that our reason is corrupted. So with the reason that is corrupted, you cannot expect all the beautiful truths of religion and philosophy will be understood by the people, the very people who has a problem with their own intellect, with their own mind. Understand that their mind is not clear. Yeah? Their mind is not disciplined. Their way of thinking, say the Malay word is kecamuk, yeah? No discipline in thinking. So you have that.
Salam, Prof. Just to remind you, if you want to have a Q&A for half an hour, you have about
I think I'm coming close I'm coming close. I'm coming close, Anand. Now, but I just mention one more about this, the idea of natural religion. Religion of nature and the natural religion. Ibn Rus believed that, and other Muslims, and Ibn Sina also believed in that. I just want to mention this. The good friend of Ibn Rus, they were good friends. I mean, also as philosophers, they quarrel often also. That the name, have you heard, I'm sure, the name of Ibn Tufail. Ibn Tufail, the Latinized name, Abu Bakar Ibn Tufail, who wrote a book called the Living Son of the Awake, Hay Ibn Azan, who brought out the idea of this natural religion. Talks about that the abandoned, or a small child was put on the island that they found by the deer, or by the door, and then until 7 years age of maturity, he was independent in that island. No one else. He was the one human being, but he found salvation. He found, in other words, the highest truth in terms of his. He was the perfect man without any outside intervention, without any inside help, except that he was alone. He lived with nature. He was alone with nature. Nature was his teacher. No other human, no human teacher. But he reached a state of perfection. This is popular theme among some Muslim philosophers, the idea that it is possible to reach that state, the level of truth without the help of revelation that we normally understand. Okay, Doctor, I just want to close it because I put here, mentioned Thomas Aquinas. No, Thomas Aquinas died in 1274. He was in the West, of course, he's a Catholic theologian. He was he was called a saint in Christianity. But Thomas Aquinas was influenced by Al-Farabi, was influenced by Ibn Sina, also by Ibn Rus, but he also among the people in the West who misunderstood Ibn Rushd. I mean, he really thought that Ibn Rushd believed in these two, the two truth theory. So because of that, Ibn Rushd received a damnation from him. But in the context of Salmi, Thomas Aquinas said, philosophy is the handmaiden of theology. So in the Christian context, what's universal? Muslims, philosophers, and theologians who have no problem accepting the very central thesis by Thomas Aquinas, philosophy is the handmaiden of theology. How within Christian theology he tried to give that, that's another set of experience, different kind of experience, but good for comparison, how Aquinas dealt with the relationship between philosophy and theology, and how Muslim thinkers dealt. But I think if you're looking for the closest in Islam to Aquinas, it will be Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali would be the closest in terms of thinking, thought on the subject of philosophy and theology. So I thought by giving these historical examples, I have illustrated a little bit about the complementary role of religion and philosophy. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much, Prof. Osman, for your very, I think it was a very detailed discussion on the theme of this complementary role played by religion and philosophy over the history. Besides Albert Einstein, you talked about the views of various Muslim scholars, including Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd. You mentioned in brief Ibn Tufail, and finally you ended with very briefly again on Thomas Aquinas. There's been a very active discussion also going on in the chat, but I think I'm going to follow the the views maybe given by the organizers, and that we would like to have maybe questions directly in this question time rather than from the chat. In case there are no questions, then I will maybe go back and pick out some. And I think there's a good system that has come out. There have been some participants who have indicated that they want to ask questions. Yeah? So I'm just going to go according to my record, who has indicated this. Halimah Muhammad Said, I think you have indicated you want to ask a question, I think, and follow, sorry, no, okay, thank you very much. Although I do know you have asked quite a number of questions in the chat. Arif Subhan, you have a request to ask a question, please. Maybe Brother Shahran can unmute, help to unmute Arif Subhan.
Yeah, Halimah is already on unmute already, and Arif too.
Yeah, but I think
Halimah, you can.
you have a question or no question, because you were.
Halimah?
I think I've already typed out my question in the box.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me for the benefit of Prof. Osman, see if I represent your question correctly. You've basically asked. Well, your latest question was, Hikmah is Allah's guidance for our day-to-day life, and you're asking if that's correct. Hikmah is wisdom. So maybe Prof. Osman, Hikmah as guidance for our day-to-day life, rather than something bigger.
In the writings of the philosophers, Muslim philosophers, Sufis, and also Kalam, Hikmah is of two types, or has two branches: theoretical Hikmah and practical Hikmah. So when it comes to question of to the kind of Hikmah that is needed in guiding our life, more at the level of the principles, and even at the level of details, yes, I mean, it is certainly the role of practical Hikmah. But others will point out then that's what the Sharia is all about. The Sharia is a body of practical Hikmah. It is to guide us in our individual life, in our collective life, and even in our civilizational life. Now, for the theoretical hikmah, this is more needed as a kind of the guidelines in the study, for example, in the different sciences, both in the natural sciences and in the social sciences. These social sciences need also the theoretical hikmah, in a sense with regard to the, and this was spelled out by Al-Farabi in the book I mentioned, in the attainment of happiness. So happiness cannot be attained as well without the theoretical hikmah, something to guide. If we are academics, we are scholars in different fields of study, we need also guidance in terms of ideas. We do a lot of premises, assumptions. Why do we have to depend on assumptions? Because it shows that there are things that we don't know yet, and we have to assume. But is it possible? It is possible that sometimes that we assume we don't know the answer. That could be the answer by going to the theoretical hikmah that is contained in the book of Revelation. But to your question, yes, in other words, it is a guide. Hikmah is a very important guide of our individual life, both in regarding our thought and our action. Because every human being has two dimensions. You know? And religion also deals with these two dimensions. Hikmah deals with two dimensions. That it is a way of life, that religion is a way of life. And what you mean by way of life is that it is a way of thinking and a way of acting. The two must go together. Not enough just acting only without thinking or thinking only without acting. The two must be harmonious.
Oh, just a continuation, because there was an earlier question. The Muslim world unfortunately faces, societies that maybe are not having access to education or who don't have knowledge about their religion. So for people who are not informed or who are not educated or who are not learned, what is the most efficacious path towards achieving religion and faith and therefore eternal salvation? Also from Halima, please.
Well, I mean, we are living in the best of times and the worst of times. You say that no opportunity, no access the access to knowledge is everywhere. Yeah. So in a sense, we are going back to the good old days when people will look for knowledge, not because of the institution, but simply just go for individuals who have the knowledge. Right? Institutions play less important role in the past, and maybe thanks to our modern information technology and also thanks to COVID, there are new ways, new access, new avenues to knowledge that open up to the extent that everybody will have that opportunity. Well, if they don't have the material means, the tools, then the more fortunate should help the less fortunate who don't have, which is an issue. Yeah, question. Some schools are not equipped with this modern tools of education. But it's the role of the government, the people in power, to do that. But at the voluntary level, I will say the access is there.
So in other words, it is really an obligation in society, ultimately on the state, to make sure that everyone is given education. I think
that's what our Prophet said. Seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave. It's a lifelong education. Long before UNESCO talk about lifelong education, the Prophet 1,400 years ago talk about from the cradle to the grave. Yeah.
Long before UNESCO.
Yeah.
Right.
Long before UNESCO. Yeah. The Prophet talked about that. And also every Muslim, male and female. It's not only for male. It's not only education for 50% of the population. No, that's against Islam.
Prof, thank you very much, the organizers, for allowing me to ask this question. Alhamdulillah, it's always a pleasure to listen to Prof. Osman. I actually wanted to ask you a question with regards to our current situation, given the fact that we have COVID, as you've touched upon earlier. I was going through the Muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun, and he talks about the criticisms of several historians, and the issues that he talks about relate to partisanship towards a creed or opinion, overconfidence in one's sources, the failure to understand what is intended, a mistaken belief in the truth, and the inability to place an event in its real context. So my question to you, Prof, as with the Muqaddimah, for example, Ibn Khaldun talks about civilization as going through cycles. And at one stage or the other, the civilization would reach a point where it decays. Do you think that living in the time of COVID, living in the time of spiritual morass, do you think that we are in a situation where we are, in a way, in a form of decay, talking about our civilization right now?
Well, we can look at the issue from different angles. Yes, Ibn Khaldun talks about the cycles in human history, but the cycle is not really for the whole of humanity, but for particular societies, particular civilizations. It does not talk about humanity as a whole. We are coming to that in the sense that as our world becomes more global, and become more interdependent, and certainly we have that feeling. So modern means of communication have brought us together. So in the sense that our destiny, our fate, is going to be differently experienced from people in the past. In the past, people talk about the history of a particular people, the history of a particular civilization, or the rise and fall of dynasties within that civilization. Civilization again goes, but the people in power, the dynasties change. Yeah, one dynasty replaced by another. How long one dynasty rule and so on. That's the question of details. That is for the historians. That is for the political scientists and so on. But the point is, I got your question. You are trying to add, referring to COVID. Yes, that's why in my recent few days ago, I talk about religion and science issues to COVID-19. In other words, because our world has become a global village, thanks to modern means of communication. So our consciousness as a human being, as a member of the human family, is quite different from our ancestors. And in the feeling of that closeness, in the sense that we have now a common destiny. There are many things that, for example, the question of the ecology of planet Earth. So since the 1970s, there have been some people who wrote about only one Earth. People don't talk about only one Earth before. The need does not arise to talk about one Earth 100 years ago, all right? But today, when you talk about climate change, it's as if you're talking about climate in Cyberjaya and Putrajaya and in Pahang, Kampung. No, in other words, now it is a global perspective, and therefore the question of rise and fall now, because talking about civilization now, is civilization of the entire human race. In other words, we ask the question: where are we as human beings, as the human species? Are we happy or not with the state of our civilization? If we're not happy, I'm sure that that feeling is shared by many others in Latin America, in Europe, Africa, and so on. And I emphasize that this is where Islam has to come in. There's a reason. Yeah? In fact, the responsibility of Islam is even more, because God made Islam the last of his religion. And therefore, since there's not going to be any more divine message, there is Islam's claim. After the Quran, there's not going to be any more divine message. If you understand by revelation in that sense, now it means that problem, in other words, the Quran now has messages for the entire humanity in trying to address our common problems. That's why in the Quran, 27 verses devoted entirely to the entire human race, which is, O humankind, O humankind, Ya Ayyuhan Nas, 27 verses, right? And they deal with different agenda of humanity. Okay.
Prof, one stream of questions are also wanting you to address. You know, this you mentioned about falsafah and you talked about kalam. I remember many years ago when Mustafa Cherich was, joking with Professor Al-Parsalan. He mentioned that, kalam was the falsafah kabir. Yeah? It was the bigger, the more important or the bigger philosophy. And in that sense, there is a question here about the schools of theology and the role of the Ash'ari school of Kalam and the Mu'tazili school. And is there any restriction of one school? Did Mu'tazilah Kalam play a bigger role in the development of science as compared to, say, Ash'ari school? Your opinion, Prof.
As I explained, you cannot expect to have consensus among the intellectuals, among the scholars, academics, on everything now. Of course, one characteristic about Islamic thought is that it is divided into schools. This is very important compared to the modern situation. In classical time, traditional, the emphasis is on school. You belong to a particular school. Of course, there are exceptions, like Biruni, a great scientist. I'm considering him as the greatest scientist of all times, greatest Muslim scientist. He did not belong to any particular school. All right, you have that kind of expression. But in the case of the majority, they belong to Christian schools, whether school of law, or school of Kalam, or school of falsafa, or school of Sufism. So you belong to a different school. Why? Because in Islam, what is important is that you speak from a perspective rather than giving your individual point of view. Muslim and the thinkers in the Islamic civilization were not individualistic thinkers. Because they spoke, or they don't say, in my opinion, according to me. No, they talk less about that. All right? They talk about from what perspective. And precisely because on intellectual matters, on scientific matters, philosophical matters, there are many perspectives. So the difference between, say, now you mentioned the schools of Kalam, right? The Ash'ari Kalam, the Maturidi Kalam, the Mu'tazilite, there are different schools of Kalam, right? Why do you have different schools? Because they, number one, they concentrate on different aspects of divine attributes. There are hundreds and hundreds of divine attribute qualities, not just 99. That's just symbolic. 99 beautiful names. But it doesn't mean that God's quality is limited to 99. That would be absurd. Yeah? So in other words, because of that. The number two, in terms of, they could differ in terms of methodology, in terms of proofs, in terms of methods of proving their claims. That's why the difference between the Quran, and then use one. They use Quran. Do in the Quran and at different things and from different angles, and they go on fighting each other. This is the problem. Sometimes we need also another group to intervene. So that the Sufis said on many issues they came to reconcile the claims of the Mutakallimun and the Falasifa. this kind of situation will go on, will never end. But what we need is, we choose what is best, what is best. God gives us wisdom, gives us uncle, and then study the claim. And what is important is sincerity. What God is looking for is sincerity, not the perfection of your mind, of your intellect.
Prof, there's a question here about the ideals and the realities, the ideals that Islam talks about, and then on the other hand, the realities of the Muslim world. Coming from Sanen Marshall, how come Azerbaijan scientists did not discover the heliocentric system? And how come Muslim civilization still struggles even with the idea of evolution? So
I would like to advise you to read the book, because I wrote a long article on that question. The title of the book is Islamic Perspectives on Science and Technology, published by Springer, arranged by IIIT. At that time, I was at IIIT. We organized a conference. So the book, that's the title of the book, and there's I was the keynote speaker, and I mentioned about the relationship between science and technology and the Sharia, and there was raised the question. It was not just, it's purely a scientific, in other words, the issue that was raised is not simply a scientific issue. It was also a cultural issue. Al-Biruni, for example, knew of the heliocentric thing. He knew that the planets revolve around the sun, and the Earth was not the center of the planetary system. But as a practicing scientist, also as a practical, as a pragmatic scientist. So he said there are two issues. One is theoretical, the other is practical. The theoretical issue is, are we going to emphasize the heliocentric or the geocentric theory? The other one is the question of its practical utility for the purpose of looking at the new moon, determining the new moon, for example. Are you going to use the heliocentric theory or the geocentric theory? After giving much thought to the subject, Al-Biruni said, we sacrifice something for the sake of a bigger thing. It caused a lot of confusion, in a sense, what it was called the revolution. You're going to be a revolution. The question is whether we want to have that revolution, where people will be, in a sense, will have difficulty in understanding the meaning of what they experience daily, that the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, all this kind of the apparent reality that we see around based on not what is real, but what is apparent. And the Quran does use also that thing, apparent symbolic language rather than what it really is. To go at that time, talking about the time, at that time, in the 10th century, 11th century, to force the idea of heliocentric, all right? For the sake of what? Yeah. My simple thing is that even Al-Biruni feels that he has a moral obligation to hide certain truths for the sake of the majority. There will not be, will go to that experience that normally accompanies all revolutions, and here in the case of revolution of thought. But in the West, it was different at the time of Copernicus. But even then, when Copernicus was known to the Ottoman scientists, after this very, very important, I explained this in my Tawhid and Science, the Turkish response to modern science. Now, in 17th century, 16th century, 17th century Ottoman science, they knew about the heliocentricity, but they still retain their mathematical astronomy based on the geocentric, because they say, look at our mathematical astronomy. It's far superior to the mathematical astronomy of Europe at the time of Copernicus. In other words, the question of the necessity of adopting one about the and not the other. We have to also look at the cultural consideration, not just the scientific.
Thank you, Prof. We only have 5 minutes and there are so many questions in the chat. I hope the organizers will maybe get these questions and post it to Prof. Osman and you may answer directly. But maybe as a last question, Prof. Osman, this is from Nuruddin. What do you think about the emergence of the new atheism movement that is spread globally through the works of popular writers such as Richard Dawkins and Yuval Harari? Do we also need to use popular methods to spread a more theistic understanding of science as pioneered by scholars such as Syed Hussain Nasr, Ismail Faruqi, Professor Latas, and scholars in the past like Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd?
Well, this is not a new problem. Atheism has existed in every age, right? And the causes of that, of course, differ from age to age. It's not the same. Therefore, what those people who are interested in addressing the issue in the context of our time will need to answer what has led people to leave religion or even to abandon God. That is the question. Until we understand that, we are not able to deal with the question. And therefore the answer in our time is not the same as in the same time of Aristotle, in the same time of Al-Ghazali, or or in the case of China now, the Republic of China now, it's different. And another thing is that when dealing with this problem of thinking or problem of ideas, we should pay more attention to the individual approach rather than this collective approach. In other words, what I mean is at least a group approach, in the sense that we understand what are the arguments. We have to have arguments, because this is basically a question of the countering the premises of these people who claim to be atheists. Why? Why do they believe in they are atheists? In other words, atheism is basically a state of mind that is not contented with certain explanations that the believers give. So if believers give the wrong reason why they believe, that's not going to appeal to the atheists. So I think it's just, you don't need a civilizational agenda to deal with that. What you need is a group of intelligent people who understand religion, who understand philosophy, use logic. Sometimes it's just a question of logical, twisting logical kind of thing, not to say, oh, it's as if they take comfort that they don't believe in God or something. But when you ask for argument, they really don't have good argument. So I think not to worry about that. The only thing that is done, do your work. What's important is the art of thinking. And certainly, maybe let this my concluding statement, because it's a role of philosophy and religion like it, the role of logic. Today, many of the minds of people are in a state of confusion, indiscipline. In Malay, say, fikiran yang keruh, bukan fikiran yang jernih. Pemikiran kejam, because no discipline. Thinking is an art. So let us teach the art of thinking, which traditionally speaking was the art of logic, mantik, the language of mantik. That's why Al-Farabi put there. After language, everybody wants to become a philosopher. So first, learn the science of language, then the science of logic. There's a close connection between logic and language. two of the areas in which today our students are very poor. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much, Prof. It's really sad that we don't have more time, but I hope that we will have other occasions for us to continue this discussion. This idea of complementary roles played by philosophy and religion in building civilization, I think is not a new issue. It's not going to be resolved by the lecture today. It's going to be continue to be debated. But let me just end by quoting again the two scholars that you started with. Science without religion is blind. Religion without science is lame. And then technology without the Sharia is arrogant, and Sharia without technology is impotent. I think these two views from a modern philosopher, scientist, and from a classical Muslim scholar is apt way to end the session. So I once again thank Prof. Osman and all the 230 plus participants for remaining with us throughout this session. Apparently, online sessions have a maximum capacity of 1.5 hours or 2 hours, but we've had a session for 3+ hours this morning. So thank you all for being with us and staying with us. We have a short break, but I think we will then come back again for the next session. So I now hand the session back, I think, to Wan Hikmah, or is that it? Yeah, can I hand it back?